Hi, welcome to Jessica. I'm your host, Jessica Rector. History. How many of us really know about our own personal history, our family history, or the history of where we actually come from, where our ancestors come from? That's what we're going to discuss today, our history and how we can know more about it and why we should know more about it. Please welcome my guest today, Luis. Welcome, Luis. Please pronounce your last name for us.
De Amechathurra.
I had problems pronouncing that, so I said I'm just going to leave it up to him to pronounce it.
Don't feel alone. Everybody does.
I'm sure they butcher it. Do they butcher it a lot?
Pretty much, usually.
Or they just say,
it's
Luis?
remarkable, though. Some people do a pretty good job.
Really?
Surprisingly, yeah.
Really? So where is it from?
It's actually Basque, from the northern part of Spain.
Very nice. So tell us a little bit about your history.
Well, I was born in the Philippines and grew up there until I came to this country when I was about, the first time around 8. I went back to the Philippines and then came here again permanently when I was 12.
Okay. And why did you come the first time and then go back?
Well, the first time has to do with the war. The first time I was born in 1937. So when the war caught our family in the Philippines, it was 1941, of course, December. And we were trapped there for the duration of the war. And I lost a big chunk of my family during the course of the war. And after the war, my mother had a brother, actually 2 brothers, living in the United States. So we came to the United States with her for a couple of years, then went back to the Philippines. And then when she was there, she met an American who was actually a naval officer and married him and came back to the United States.
So you were born in the Philippines, but your last name is Basque.
My grandfather, I'm not entirely clear of the history of it, but apparently he got a land grant from the Spanish Crown for some reason in the latter part of the 19th century, 1870, right around there. And he started sugar plantations on the island of Negros in the Philippines. And my father was born there. My mother had a similar kind of background, but she was born on another island in the Philippines from also a Spanish family. And somehow they met and were married in Negros, where I was born.
Very nice. So tell us what happened to your father and your brother, briefly.
Well, very briefly, I had a brother and I have a sister, so there were 3 of us. My mother's father was an American. After the Spanish-American War, the Americans sent over a group of about 1,000 teachers to help educate and establish a school system in the Philippines. And my grandfather was one of those people on my mother's side. He was an American. So when my mother was born, she had dual citizenship.
Right.
She was Filipino and American. So when the Japanese invaded the Philippines, my mother was put in a concentration camp. In those days, because my father was not an American, my father was Spanish and Filipino, I didn't have to go in a concentration camp with her. So I was...
She was in the concentration camp because she was American?
Yes. She was an American citizen. She'd never been in the United States. Spoke English with a Spanish accent, a Spanish-Filipino accent. But she had to go to concentration camp. She would have been around 25 or 26 at the time. So
what happened to your family after that?
Well, one day my father, we were shot at, and my father and my brother were killed. My brother was 4. I was sitting right next to him when he was killed.
And why were you shot at?
That's a fairly involved story, but it was an assassination. It's very complicated what happened in that period of time. After the Japanese took over the Philippines, they concentrated their forces in Manila, but all the military forces were in the major cities, and the country became a little bit of a vigilante society, and all sorts of brigands ruled in the countryside. And they called themselves guerrillas, but some of them were not really guerrillas, they were just brigands. And if you got on the wrong side of them, as my father did, I think there were other reasons as well, but anyway, one night...
But I don't think a lot of people know that Americans, or that your mother, who was an American citizen, would have been put in a concentration camp.
Oh yes, many, many people were put in, all the Americans and all the British, anybody who was not a member of the Axis, which would have been Germany, Japan, and Italy.
Well, why is it we tend to hear so much about the Jews then?
Well, because they were in Europe. I mean, if there were a Jew in Manila and he happened to be an American citizen, he would have been put in a concentration camp, as with all the other Americans. The Japanese didn't differentiate ethnically. Mm-hmm. It was more, are you an American citizen or are you whatever kind of citizen you are?
So what made you want to find out all this information about your history, about all the war and all that stuff?
Well, what happened, during the course of the war, I retained all my memories, but I never really discussed it with anybody.
Right.
After that night when my father was killed, I sort of withdrew. I suppressed all my emotions, and I remembered everything, but I really didn't let it get to me. My sister blocked out everything. So from that point on and throughout the war years, she really remembered nothing about it. Mm. So one day we were talking on the phone, and I was living in New Jersey and she was living in California. And she asked me to talk about it and tell her about it, remind her about it. So I started writing it down. And that provoked the questioning, how did all this come about? Because it didn't just happen in a vacuum.
Right.
What led up to it, why was my father there? And I started going back and following the whole history of my father from the time he was a boy he was educated with his brothers in England.
Where did you find that information?
From talking with very few of the men were alive from his generation.
Why
brothers.
Is that?
They died. They were old. My father was quite a bit older than my mother. My father would have been around 45 when he married my mother when she was around 20. Mm. And so
back then that was a big age gap.
Huge age gap. And but I had some cousins who were considerably older than I was. One in particular, Maruja, who lives in Arkansas now. And she was actually living in Spain when my father, after he left the United States in 1932, he moved back to Spain because he had been living in the United States. And he lived with my uncle and my cousin, Maruja, who was she's about 88 now, so she's almost 20 years older than I am, or about 20 years older than I am, 21 years older than I am. So her memories are much sharper, and she was able to help me a lot. Then my aunt, some of my aunts were still alive then. They were in their 90s, or close to 90, and they didn't remember a lot. My mother always refused to discuss the war. She wouldn't talk about anything, so I rarely got very little out of her.
But do you find that that's the case in a lot of people who went through that they don't want to talk about it, or that they do?
Yeah, the war actually traumatized my mother very, very, very severely, and she was on all sorts of medication after the war to help her deal with it. Anybody who goes through that comes out of it with horrific nightmares.
Right.
Because I was a little boy, in those days they didn't give children pills. But because my mother was an adult, they started giving her sleeping pills and all sorts of stuff to deal with it, but she never really learned how to deal with it, cope with it.
Right.
What I did was the opposite. I just didn't think about it, didn't talk about it, but it affected me in other ways.
Like what?
I suppose it made me very suspicious of people. It made me sort of withdraw and be a little bit very distrustful of authority.